and questions will be taken at the end. I'll answer any questions that come into, or ask any questions that come into chat, and then turn it over to Doug for any questions that occur in the classroom. And of course, Louis will repeat any questions or comments for those of you at home, and enjoy your class.
High-tech problem. Let's turn the thing on. Welcome, everyone, to the third and final session of the standard jazz repertoire, the Vocalists. It's my pleasure to welcome back our wonderful speaker, Mr. Louis Morel, who, as you know, has a passion for anything jazz. And best of all, he has a wonderful way of communicating his love for jazz to us, and we've really learned a lot and enjoyed it. So, Louis, thank you again.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone in the classroom and in cyberspace. And welcome to the third and final installment of our survey, our superficial survey, as it were, of the Great American Songbook, the Standard Jazz Repertoire. Just a reminder, I explained to you on 2 previous occasions that it is expected that every jazz musician will have a good foundation in the standard jazz repertoire so that he or she can walk onto nearly any stage, join unknown musicians, and play along with one of these standards. So for jazz musicians, sufficient knowledge of many of these songs is essential for survival. How many are there? Somewhere between 250 and 300 such songs. Many of them are decades old, some much older than others. Today, we're going to encounter some that are more contemporary. Where do these songs come from? As I pointed out, and as you've noticed, some of them come from musical reviews, some from Broadway musicals, some from movie soundtracks, and also from compositions by jazz musicians that composed the music, and lyrics were added later on. So, a reminder that jazz is, if nothing else, a musical genre that calls upon reimagination, reinventing itself by stretching boundaries. And we've learned about some songs, their origins, the composers who came up with those songs, and we've listened to different versions of the same song to emphasize the differences in inflection, in tone, in accenting on lyrics and on sounds, and we'll do more of that today. We start with Hoagland Carmichael today. Yes, Hoagie Carmichael. He was born at the very, very end of the 19th century, but turned out to be a very successful composer, lyricist, pianist, cornetist, band leader, singer, and yes, even an actor throughout a very lengthy career. He was largely influenced by his mother, who at the beginning of the 20th century played piano in the local movie houses. And I'm not sure how he had access, living in Bloomington, Indiana, possibly radio from Chicago, but he was exposed to Black jazz ensembles. And that influenced him considerably. But in spite of his mother's influence and his interest in music, he enrolled in law school at Indiana University in his hometown. That's where he met cornetist Bix Beiderbecke, a native of Davenport, Iowa. And Beiderbecke, the cornetist, encouraged Carmichael to continue songwriting after listening to some of his compositions. This is while at Indiana University. Well, it turned out that in 1924, Beiderbecke recorded Hoagie Carmichael's Riverboat Shuffle. Carmichael had a very lengthy career and is famous for a lot of songs. He wrote several hundreds, and 4 dozen or so became major hits throughout his lifetime. Some of them include Stardust and Georgia on My Mind. We're going to listen to Skylark. He collaborated with lyricist Johnny Mercer in 1941 to create this song. It was supposed to be part of a musical tribute to Bix Beiderbecke. That never saw the light of day, but some of the songs that were composed did. Johnny Mercer's wife claimed that it took her husband, Johnny, a year to come up with the right phrases to match what she called the convoluted melodic lines of Skylark. Her husband, Johnny, said, no, that's not the case. I did it in half an hour. Well, what is probably true is that they're both right. The idea may have germinated in his head or somewhere else for a year, and then in half an hour, he was able to put it on paper and give us Skylark, at least the lyrics to it. We're going to hear Billy Eckstine first. Notice the spelling, T-E-I-N. That was a spelling that his family had. But when he became a professional musician, he changed it, permutation of the letter E to the end, still pronounced Eckstine. Eckstine was a very successful singer and band leader, a musician, a composer, and an actor as well. He started singing publicly at a church bazaar. He was 11 years old at the time, and that led him to go to Howard University in Washington, D.C. And there, while working part-time at the university theater, he met Ethel Waters, and she would give him money for running errands for her. Well, that money went to a good cause. It allowed him to pay the entry fee into a singing contest, and because this is what it is, he won. That got him to meet Earl Hines, the band leader and pianist, and he joined Earl Hines' band as a singer. That's where he met some luminaries, or people who were to become luminaries, as they went in and out of the Earl Hines Orchestra. That included Dizzy Gillespie and Sarah Vaughan and Charlie Parker. About 5 years later, he left the orchestra and Eckstine formed his own band. He had achieved some success, and now he wanted to use the emerging bebop influences to create a new sound. And to do that, he hired a number of young musicians who were experimenting with that sound, including Dexter Gordon, a young Miles Davis, Kenny Dorham, the trumpeter, Wardell Gray, the pianist, and Art Blakey, the drummer. So let's listen for a moment to the Earl Hines Band and Billy Eckstine singing an excerpt from Skylark. I want to point out to those in cyberspace that you will see a grayed out portion of your screen momentarily as I search for the media player.
Where my love can be. Is there a meadow in the mist where someone's waiting to be kissed? Skylark, have you seen a valley green with spring, where my heart can go a journey over the shadows in the rain to a blossom-covered lane? And in your lonely flight, haven't you heard the music in the night? Wonderful music, faint as the will-o'-the-wisp, crazy as a loon, sad as a gypsy serenading the moon. Oh, Skylark, I don't know if you can find these things, but my heart is riding on your wings. So if you see them anywhere, won't you take me there?
Skylark was recorded many, many times in the past half century or so. And one of them is Cassandra Wilson, who recorded it. She was born in Jackson, Mississippi in 1955. Her father was a music educator. He played bass in a jazz ensemble, and of course was a major influence on Cassandra Wilson. She got her first guitar at age 6, and she played the piano at age 6, and a few years later obtained a guitar, and that helped her to write a number of folk-oriented songs that, as a teenager, that had some popularity. However, her influences were not so much folk-oriented. They were jazz-oriented. The likes of Shirley Horn and Betty Carter, Nina Simone, all people that if you're not familiar with as vocalists, you should look up. She became acquainted with Steve Coleman, the saxophonist who had formed a group called the M-Bass Collective. And in 1981, he hired her to sing with the band. Only 5 years later, she formed her own band, and in 1986 had her first recording, the album titled Blue Light Till Dawn. Her roots are deeply connected in jazz. I mentioned those influences for her, but in her repertoire, she not only interprets jazz standards, such as the ones we're discussing here, but she also reinvents pop songs, the likes of people like Van Morrison and the Beatles and Joni Mitchell that she has reinvented and recorded. So we're going to listen to an excerpt from her version of Skylark, which came from the 1995 album New Moon Daughter, with a trio of musicians.
Skylark, skylark, skylark. Have you anything to say to me? Can you tell me where my love came? Is there a meadow in the mist where someone's waiting to be kissed? Skylark, have you seen the valley green with spring, where my heart can go a journey over the shadows and the rain to a blossom-covered lane, and in your lonely flight, haven't you heard the music in the night? Beautiful music, faint as a will-o'-the-wisp, crazy as a lone, sad as a gypsy serenading the moon. Skylark, I don't know if you can find these things, but my heart is riding on your wings, and if you see them anywhere, won't you lead me there?
That's a far cry from what Billy Eckstine did in the 1940s. Cassandra Wilson, if you're not familiar with her, she is still performing and recording. Tom Lellis is not a household name. Perhaps he should be. He was born in Cleveland in 1946 and started singing jazz in his teens and became somewhat popular and well-known in a small circle. He moved to New York in 1973 in his mid-20s and found jobs singing in nightclubs, which made him more recognizable by others. Well, he got a recording deal and did his first recording in 1979. Oddly, he's had very few recordings since then. He's kept performing and he composes and he sings, but for whatever reason, not so many record deals. However, the pundits believe that he is a very insightful interpreter of all those great lyrics that we hear from the people who were working in Tin Pan Alley. Now, in addition to being a singer, as I mentioned, he's also a lyricist, and he has taken instrumentals from very well-known composers, jazz composers, such as Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea and others, and he has penned some lyrics to those songs. That includes Wayne Shorter's ESP. Wayne Shorter is a name, and McCoy Tyner, all luminaries in the jazz world. Wayne Shorter is one of many musicians who played with Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers. So Tom Lellis, as I said, is not a well-known name, but I think you'll agree that he has a great voice. Here he's accompanied by the Metropole Orchestra, which is conducted by John Clayton. So he has a full band behind him. We'll hear an excerpt of his version of Skylark.
Skylark, have you anything to say to me? Won't you tell me where my love can be? Is there a meadow in the mist where someone's waiting to be kissed? Skylark, have you seen a valley green with spring, where my heart can go down over the shadows and to a blossom-covered lane, and in your lonely flight, haven't you heard the music in the night? Wonderful music, faint as a will-o'-the-wisp, crazy as a moon, sad as a gypsy serenading you. Skylark, I don't know if you can find these things, but my heart is riding on wings. So if you see them anywhere, won't you lead me there?
Johnny Mercer's wife may have been wrong about how long it took her husband to write the lyrics, but she may have been right about the convoluted melodic lines that Carmichael had put down for this song. That's Tom Lellis. We move from Hoagy Carmichael to Gene DePaul, truly a pillar among composers in the 1930s and 40s. He started as a piano teacher. Then he got a job, or several jobs, as a pianist, working for dance bands and playing in theaters. And then he also became a singer himself, though he never gained tremendous fame or fortune from that. It was mostly from composing and arranging for vocal groups. He's best known for the songs that he contributed to movies, especially the movie musicals, and as you will find out, in some unexpected movies. He collaborated chiefly with two lyricists. We're going to hear from Don Ray. He contributed with him in the early 40s. And together they wrote the score for the movie Keep 'Em Flying, You Don't Know What Love Is, I'll Remember April, and Star Eyes, all songs that were introduced in movies in the early 40s. In the 1950s, DePaul contributed, or collaborated rather, with Johnny Mercer again, and together they wrote the scores for Seven Brides for Seven Brothers and Lil Abner. We're going to focus on You Don't Know What Love Is, which was composed in 1941. It was supposed to be in the musical score for Keep 'Em Flying, which was an Abbott and Costello movie. And that movie starred a 25-year-old Martha Ray. She played the role of twin sisters, a foreshadow perhaps of what Patty Duke would do in the 1960s. So it turns out that You Don't Know What Love Is was dropped from that movie, from that soundtrack. But it was recorded by Carol Bruce shortly after the movie Keep 'Em Flying was released. So it became known to the public that way. The following year, Carol Bruce performed You Don't Know What Love Is in the movie, the comedy Behind the Eight Ball with the Ritz brothers. Dick Foran and Carol Bruce worked together in several movies, and they performed in both movies, Keep 'Em Flying and Behind the Eight Ball, two comedies that had a lot of musical qualities in them. Interestingly enough, in the 1940s, You Don't Know What Love Is was not a big hit. However, in the 1950s, it got revived. And that's because, for whatever reason, the people who were introducing bebop and the new age of jazz in the 1950s got interested in it, thinking it was a good vehicle for them. So people like Thad Jones and Chet Baker, Sonny Rollins, Miles Davis, and many others recorded their instrumental versions of You Don't Know What Love Is. I want to draw your attention to the opening lyric you're going to be hearing over and over again. Don Ray wrote, "You don't know what love is till you've learned the meaning of the blues." The first interpreter we're going to hear is Dick Haymes. Unfortunately for him, Mr. Haymes led a very troubled life, as you will find out. He is British. His parents operated a cattle farm in Argentina in the in late teens. And his parents separated. His mother moved with her son Dick to Paris, and they did just fine until the Great Depression hit Paris and their finances were depleted. So they moved to the US. Dick got himself a summer job as a teenager singing in a hotel and decided that that was for him, singing. So he moved to Hollywood at the ripe age of 15. I don't think that there are too many opportunities of that type these days for 15-year-olds, but it was quite common almost a century ago. He had composed some songs, and he offered them to one of the most popular band leaders of the time, Harry James. And Harry said, "Thanks, but no thanks." And oddly enough, the following year, because he had heard him sing, Harry James hired Dick Haymes to front the band. And he was doing that because he was going to replace Sinatra. So a young Frank Sinatra moves on. We'll hear more about that later on. But Dick Haymes is the voice who replaced him. Well, he was considered a superior singer of ballads in his time and equal to Crosby and to Sinatra, according to some. He sang with both the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra and the Benny Goodman Orchestra, but he was, as I said, a troubled man. He was victimized by divorce. He was an alcoholic. He had tax and immigration problems with the US government. His finances were very poorly managed and easily depleted. As an actor, he was depressed by the fact that he did not get favorable reviews and had a short-lived marriage with Rita Hayworth that was rather tempestuous and did no good to his psyche either. So Dick Haymes had a brilliant beginning of a career, but it kind of petered out near the end. So we're going to listen to an excerpt of You Don't Know What Love Is, as performed by Dick Haymes with Harry James and his orchestra. And this was recorded in 1941. That first lyric.
You don't know what love is until you've learned the meaning of the blues, until you've loved a love you had to lose. You don't know what love is. You don't know how lips hurt until you've kissed and had to pay the cost, until you've flipped your heart and you have lost. You don't know what love is. Do you know how a lost heart feels the thought of reminiscing, and how lips that taste of tears lose their taste for kissing? You don't know how hearts burn for love that cannot live yet never dies, until you've faced each dawn with sleepless eyes. You don't know what love is.
We'll fast forward really about 6 decades to 2006 and meet Abigail Rickards. She's a youngster by some standards, of course. She's 41 years old this year, but a very accomplished singer. Downbeat magazine awarded her Best College Singer Awards in 2002 and 2004. That same year, she was a semifinalist at the very prestigious Thelonious Monk International Jazz Vocal Competition. The competitions occur in a number of categories, and I assure you that the people who have won, who have been runners-up, have all become stars in their own right. In 2006, she was chosen to tour the Middle East on behalf of the State Department. This is a practice that started way back in the 1950s, I believe. Dizzy Gillespie was among those who did those tours for the State Department to promote American culture and jazz in this case. So she spent some time in Yemen promoting jazz. But today, not only does she perform and occasionally record, she also is a music educator. And in collaboration with her pianist, David Berkman, they have put together a jazz singer's guidebook, a course in jazz harmony and scat singing. That's the wordless singing in jazz, but for the serious jazz vocalist. Very specific, isn't it? Not just for any jazz vocalist. Michael Gladstone is a music critic that I think epitomizes with this particular quote what we're trying to accomplish here. New vocalists will always find something new to inject into a performance of timeless songs from the Great American Songbook. And that's what I've been saying for these 3 episodes, is that they're looking to reinvent, reimagine, do something a little bit different with these songs that are timeless. So let's listen to an excerpt of You Don't Know What Love Is. This is a duet with Berkman at the piano and Abigail Rickards singing You Don't Know What Love Is.
You don't know what love is until you've learned the meaning of the blues. Until you've loved a love you had to lose. You don't know what love is. You don't know how lips hurt until you've kissed and had to pay the cost. Until you flipped your heart and you have lost. You don't know what love is. Do you know how a lost heart fears the thought of reminiscing, and how lips that taste of tears lose their taste for kissing? And you don't know how hearts burn for love that cannot live yet never ever dies.
It's an excerpt from her first album, When the Night is New, from 2006. And I think that those convoluted melodic lines came through even more convoluted. This is our first international contribution today. There will be a few more. Her name is Sine Ig. She is a Dane. She was born in 1977 and came from a musical family. Her mother was a clarinetist, her father a bassist, and she got exposed to jazz through her parents at a very young age. I have to admit, I've been to Denmark and I have found it quite a haven for jazz. It has been for decades. And there are not only jazz clubs, but also a lot of recording companies that specialize in jazz in Denmark. They love their jazz there. And if you find the record label Steeplechase, that's a Danish label, and they have some fabulous artists. Not all Danish, some are American as well. So being drawn to jazz and to music in general, she decided to enroll at the Danish Music Conservatory near her, and that led her to studies in New York City later. It is said that she is an expert at inflecting notes. And I've talked about how important it is for vocalists to be able to do that, to put accents in different locations for the phrasing that they want to produce. She can bend lyrics in unexpected ways, and she has tremendous pitch control. I don't know if this is accurate or not, but one reviewer claimed that she has perfect pitch. Maybe you'll be the judge. Her first 4 albums each earned her a Best Danish Vocal Jazz Award, and she was up for another one recently. And she has done a lot of work on what we call the Great American Songbook and has been applauded for her style in doing so. We're going to listen to an excerpt from an album that she recorded with a single musician, Thomas Fonnesbeck, another Dane. He's a bassist, and in 2014, they recorded this album on which they laid down the track for You Don't Know What Love Is. I want you to pay attention to her diction and to his playing. He's playing a bass, sometimes with a bow, sometimes he strums it like a guitar. It's a very rich textural sound that he produces. So this is their version, or an excerpt of their version of You Don't Know What Love Is.
You don't know what love is until you've learned the meaning of the blues, until you've loved a love you had to lose. You don't know what love is. You don't know how lips hurt until you've kissed and had to pay the cost, until you flipped your heart and you have lost. You don't know what love is. Do you know how a lost heart feels? The thought of rain.
Jean de Paul was cruel to his singers. That's quite a range that's required for this song, but she carries it out very nicely indeed. And I do not know how much English she learned as a youngster, but her command of the English language is fabulous for a Great Dane. We continue with Jean de Paul, but with another song that came the following year. I mentioned Dick Foran and Carol Bruce earlier. Well, Foran starred in the next Abbott and Costello movie in 1942. It was Ride 'Em Cowboy. Yes, a musical Western. I don't know how many of you are fans of Abbott and Costello, but you may remember this movie. In it, Ella Fitzgerald played a stereotypical black maid, but she did introduce us to a tisket, a tasket. And later on in the movie, she joined the Merry Macs, and together they sang Rockin' and Reelin'. It was Woody Herman's orchestra that recorded this song first and popularized it. And by the late 40s, it was, again, a vehicle for the bebop artists that were just emerging, like Bud Powell, the pianist, for example, and saxophonist Charlie Parker. We're going to hear Dick Foran in a moment sing his version from the movie. He was born in 1911, started as a singer in a band, eventually got a lot of radio performances at the time, and Warner Brothers hired him as a supporting actor because he was a crooner and they needed someone who had good looks and could croon a tune, as it was in those days. And that he did. For many years, he was a singing cowboy. He was a crooner. And in this movie, Ride 'Em Cowboy, he plays the role of an author of Western novels. And he croons this song to the ranch owner's daughter. Again, I'm still thinking of what a musical Western is. One critic at the time wrote, for a few brief minutes, the song I'll Remember April was an oasis of sanity in the madness of the rest of the movie. It turned out that Foran continued to be a matinee idol in B movies, lower budget movies that were often played after the featured movie of the day. And he had a prolific career off the big screen on television. On the small screen, you may have seen him in Gunsmoke and in Mayberry RFD and many other shows because his career spanned over 20 years on television. So Let's let me do this first. There we go. So from the movie Ride 'Em Cowboy, from the original soundtrack, let's listen to Dick Foran, Woo the Rancher's Daughter. There's a choir like this that takes over a minute.
This lovely day has lengthened into evening. We'll say goodbye to all we've ever had. Alone where we have walked together. Remember April and be glad. I'll be content. You loved me once in April. Your lips were warm and love and spring were new. But I'm not afraid of autumn and her sorrow, for I'll remember April and you. The fire will dwindle into glowing ashes, for flames and love live such a little while. I won't forget, but I won't be lonely. I'll remember April and I'll smile.
And after the singing cowboy has finished his tune, that lush choir of voices comes back. And I just have images of tumbleweeds on the screen while I'm hearing those voices, and it just does not mesh well at all. But be that as it may. So that was the first version of I'll Remember April. We move forward some 17 years and we meet Jo Stafford, a name I'm sure you're familiar with. She was trained as an opera singer, and yet she never sang operatically, partly because when she was just 18 years old, she joined the Pied Pipers. They were an octet of voices, 8 voices among the Pied Pipers, and they had some success. And eventually they broke down to a quartet. And that's when Tommy Dorsey hired the Pied Pipers in 1939. He wanted them to sing in front of the band and also to sing backup for that new singer that he had hired, the guy named Frank Sinatra. In 1944, she became a solo artist in her own right. She performed for the USO in Europe, and as such, became known as G.I. Joe. In 1947, she had tremendous success. Of all the top recordings of the year, 8 of them belonged to Jo Stafford. And it would take another decade or more for people like Elvis Presley and the Beatles to amass so many hit singles in a single year on the charts, if they even did. During the era of 1944 to 47, she was truly the top female vocalist, having sold more than 25 million records. These are 78 RPM records, not albums, 78 RPMs, 25 million of them. Her voice was said to be extremely pure, and she was considered one of the most versatile vocalists in her time. In 1949, she's the one who was the first one to sing Autumn Leaves, but yet it wasn't a hit for another 6 years when Roger Williams released a recording of it. But it was her that sang it first. We're going to listen to an excerpt from I'll Remember April with Jo Stafford singing with the Paul Weston Orchestra. This is from 1959. Weston and Stafford had married in 1952. So here's the husband and wife team, and I'll Remember April.
This lovely day will lengthen into evening. such a little while. I won't forget, but I won't be lonely. I'll remember April, and I'll smile.
Joe Stafford. You're familiar perhaps with the name Margaret Whiting. She is another Michigan connection for us. I think it's our fourth one already. She was born in Detroit in 1924, and her father, Richard Armstrong, worked for Capitol Records. Capitol Records was formed in 1942 by the lyricist Johnny Mercer and two partners. And her father, Richard Armstrong, composed Hooray for Hollywood and Shirley Temple's inimitable On the Good Ship Lollipop, among other things. But back to Margaret Whiting. So she worked with Johnny Mercer, the lyricist, when she was a mere 7 years old. I'm not sure how many of his songs she sang and in what venues, but she was one of the first artists to sign for the newly formed Capitol Records, which, as I said, was founded by Johnny Mercer. For about 8 or 9 years, she had a string of hits, fronting big bands and also on her own as Margaret Whiting. And interestingly enough, she kept performing well into the 1990s and recording as well. And we're going to listen to a recording that was done in 1985. So presumably she's 61 years old at this point. The album was titled The Ladies in Love with You, and it features pianist Hubert Arnold, Gene Bertoncini on guitar, and Richard Wilcox on drums. And here's I'll Remember April.
This lovely day will lengthen into evening. We'll sigh goodbye to all we've ever had. Alone, where we have walked together, I'll remember April and be glad. I'll be content. You loved me once in April, your lips were warm, and love and spring were new, but I'm not afraid of autumn and her sorrow, for I'll remember April and you. The fire will dwindle into glowing ashes, for flames and love live such a little while. I won't forget, but I won't be lonely. I'll remember April and I'll smile.
The voice of Margaret Whiting. Now we move to our first jazz musician as a composer of a song that was included eventually into the standard jazz repertoire. His name was Oliver Nelson, and he was born in 1932 in St. Louis. Sadly, and people claim it's because he worked so hard and it was so stressful for him, he died at age 43 of a heart attack. But as a youngster, he learned the piano at age 6 and took up the saxophone at age 11. And he became a very renowned saxophonist, also a flutist, clarinetist, an arranger and composer, as we will see, and more importantly, perhaps for some, an educator. He attended Washington University in St. Louis, where he studied music. And in 1947, at the age of 15, he was already performing professionally. So he had a great start to a career. And between 1959 and 1961, he recorded not 2, not 4, but 6 albums, including the album titled The Blues and the Abstract Truth. I'll get back to that in a moment. So as good of a player as he was, especially a multi-instrumentalist, he was really sought after because of his arranging skills. And in fact, later in his life, Hollywood beckoned and he moved to California, and he spent the rest of his few years, the next 7 or 8 years, writing film scores and TV themes. Oliver Nelson, you may see his name up there on the screen occasionally, but as is often the case for music soundtracks, the musicians, composers are not always credited. So we don't have a complete list. Well, somebody does, but it's not easily attainable, a complete list of what he did. But you may remember or recognize these titles from 1966, Alfie, I believe that starred Michael Caine, Zigzag from 1970, and The Last Tango in Paris in 1972, among others. We're going to focus on one song, Stolen Moments. Even though he was a gifted writer, nothing in his repertoire ever came close to Stolen Moments in terms of recognition, critical acclaim, and popularity. One critic said that even if he had done nothing else in his career, this one song would have put him in the pantheon of jazz. He wrote the music, and as we'll find out, the lyric was added later. So here's a short extract from the album, The Blues and the Abstract Truth. I want you to notice the names that are surrounding him here. Eric Dolphy on alto sax and flute, George Barrow on baritone sax, a young Freddie Hubbard on trumpet, Bill Evans on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, Roy Haynes on drums, $1 million lineup here. So a short extract to give you the flavor of what the song is without lyrics. We encountered Mark Murphy earlier in an earlier episode. He is noted for his vocal improvisations, and you will find that out in a few moments. He received the Best Male Vocalist Award from Downbeat Readers in 4 years, 96, 97, 2000, 2001. He's received half a dozen Grammy nominations for Best Vocal Jazz Performance. So certainly he's a force in the field. He's the one who wrote the lyrics to this musical piece that Oliver Nelson composed, and it includes his ability to do some scat singing. So we're going to listen to an excerpt from the album of the same title, Stolen Moments. And I want to point out the name Richie Cole here, the alto saxophonist. If you see anything by Cole, you should probably lend an ear to it and listen. Here is Mark Murphy.
Stolen moments. If I told you I love you, pretty baby, would it make up for what they say? If I hold you and shield you, darling, will you linger a while today? If I hold you and pretty baby. And I know where you steal them from. There are so many things I'll teach you, and they call me a useless bum. They just shatter and clatter and batter and datter. They titter and twitter, their glitter gets better. But we're here, I steered here, it's weird. Hear those beers, dear, what's the pantomime?
Now we have a melody and we have lyrics. So we move on. We go to Ithaca, New York, home of Ithaca College, the home of the Bombers, where Darman Meter is a student. And in 1988, he took other people, 4 other singers with him to Europe, and he called his group the New York Voices. This was done under the auspices of the college. Well, they formed a group and they added a rhythm section and they started to play together. One of the 5 voices dropped out, and in 1992, another one was replaced. And the original members were Darman Meter, Kim Nazarian, Peter Eldridge, and the newcomer was Lauren Kinhan. They have been performing for over 30 years now. They are highly acclaimed, and they do everything from the big band classics of the swing era to music by Stevie Wonder. They do Brazilian songs. They do pop songs from Paul Simon. They reimagine them. Each of these 4 singers also has a separate career. They're educators, they are performers, and also recording artists. We're going to listen to the New York Voices from an album that was recorded live in Germany in 2008. And it's their version of Stolen Moments. You're going to hear Darman Meter first. He's the tenor. Then we'll hear the ensemble. And then we're going to hear Lauren Kinhan, the soprano. She'll be the leading voice. And then we'll hear some scat singing from the ensemble. In the background, the WDR, which stands for essentially the West German Public Radio Band. It's a very, that company is a very large public radio and television outfit in West Germany, and they have their own orchestra based in Cologne. So we're going to listen to their version of Stolen Moments.
If I told you I loved you, pretty baby, would it make up for what they say? If I hold you and shield you, darling, would you linger a while and stay? If I hold you and hug you, my dear, so don't argue. The gossip won't hurt you, I'll never desert you. Someday we'll find us when people won't bind us to the hands of time. I can use more than moments, pretty baby, and
just chattering, chattering, pittering, pattering, titter and twitter until it gets better. But we're here, I stare, and these beards are so weird. We'll watch the pantomime.
Sometimes four voices are better than one. Tremendous harmony there. And if you come across anything by the WDR Big Band, it's worth listening to. So I encourage you to do that. Highly recommended. One last excursion into this song, yet another international contribution, this time from a Brit named Tina May, born in Gloucester in England in 1961. She, like many others, had a classical piano training, and that did not deter her from being influenced by jazzmen, in particular, Fats Waller and Duke Ellington, somewhat different styles, but certainly of interest to us. In her 20s, she decided that she wanted to go to the continent and establish herself there. So off she went to Paris in 1985, and she became what the French called a chanteuse. She sang in cabarets and in nightclubs, and she became quite popular. But she returned to England in 1989, and she formed her own quartet, a rhythm section, to back her when she was singing. 4 years later, she won the Outstanding Young Musician Award, and by then she was already in her 30s, but she was new to the scene in terms of recording. And since then, in 95 and 98, she won the British Jazz Vocalist Award. Some people claim that she's one of the finest voices that the UK has exported when it comes to jazz. Now, if you're looking for another great British voice in jazz, you should look up Cleo Lane. Cleo Lane, very important if you want to look that up. She often was paired with her husband, John Dankworth. So let's listen to an excerpt from the album I Never Told You, which was released in 2009. It features Nikki Isles, that's a she, Nikki, not a he, Nikki, on piano, Phil Donkin on bass, and Stephen Keogh on drums. And this is their version or an excerpt of Stolen Moments.
Stolen moments, stolen moments, stolen moments, stolen moments. If I told you I loved you, pretty baby, would it make up for what they say? If I squeeze you and hold you, darling, would you linger a while today? If I hold you and hug you, my darling, don't argue, I'll never desert you, I'll never hurt you, and someday we'll find us, people won't bind us to the hands of time. Stolen moments, stolen moments. I could use more than moments with you, baby, and I know where you steal them from. There are so many things I teach certain someday we'll find people won't bind us to the hands of time.
Tina May, different accents, intonation, 3 different songs, and all a little bit different in various ways. That brings us to another jazz musician who contributed first a melody and later a lyric. And this time it's not an American, it's Antonio Carlos Brasileiro de Almeida Jobim. Nicknamed Tom by Brazilians, we know him as Antonio Carlos. And he was born in 1927. He is one of the most famous Brazilian songwriters. He's a composer, he's arranged music for bands. He's also a singer, but he's also performed as a pianist and a guitarist. He has been compared to George Gershwin. He's been referred to as George Gershwin of Brazil. And why? Because both men have contributed very large bodies of songs to the standard jazz repertoire. We're going to hear Wave, but there are others, such as Desfinado, for example, and many others. Now, they didn't come into play until the mid or late 60s. So if you think of all the tunes that we've listened to, most of them came from the first half of the 20th century. Now we're encroaching into the second half. Also, the melodies that he and Gershwin wrote were often quite memorable. And if you're not familiar with Wave, when you hear it in a moment, you'll probably recognize it. And also, if someone talks about George Gershwin and has some knowledge of Gershwin, immediately one thinks about the US and probably Tin Pan Alley, the Great American Songbook. When one says Antonio Carlos Jobim, one thinks Brazil and the Bossa Nova. Around the world, he's an exponent of the Brazilian musical style. And he's the one who made the Bossa Nova popular around the world. That album in 1963, where Stan Getz and Gil Gilberto collaborated, was a milestone for sure. For one thing, it was the first jazz album to win the Grammy Award for Album of the Year. It's the album that had the girl from Ipanema on it. And it was sung by Gil Gilberto's wife, Astrud. She had never sung in public before. That was her first recording, and she'd only sung in the shower and at home. As for Jobim, he was highly influenced by classical composers, Ravel and Debussy from France, and his Brazilian compatriots, Euri Barroso, and especially Hector Villalobos. So what did Jobim do? He took the foundation of the samba, the Brazilian sound, and he merged it with American jazz. He did it on his own, but he was helped in his recordings with a number of American musicians, as you will find out. So he popularized this style, and a lot of jazz musicians and singers around the world wanted to sing his songs. Why? It was partly because the American songbook needed to be refreshed. They had been singing Gershwin and Cole Porter and Van Heusen and others for a long time. So here comes something fresh, something new that people like. So it became adopted rather quickly. Now, Jobim is credited with the Portuguese lyrics that he added later after recording the instrumental version. We're going to hear a bit of that in a moment. But we're not quite sure who translated it into English. So he went to New York, he recorded his album titled Wave, and we're going to hear an excerpt of the title track. And if you look at the list of musicians surrounding him, again, another $1 million lineup with Jerome Richardson on flute, Jimmy Cleveland on trombone, Ron Carter on bass. There's an orchestra behind him led by Klaus Orgerman. So here's a short excerpt of Wave. And if you don't think you've heard it before, you probably have. So this started out as a bossa nova. We're going to hear it before our very ears get transformed into something totally different. Let's start with Francis Sinatra. We know him as Old Blue Eyes and perhaps the chairman of the board. I never called him Frankie Boy personally. And in a moment, we'll discover why he was known as the Voice. He had, as you now know, we heard this a few minutes ago, his beginnings with Harry James and his orchestra. And like many others, his allegiance was to making money. He was only 25 years old at the time, and Tommy Dorsey had deep pockets. And Mr. Dorsey offered Frank Sinatra a whole bunch of money, and Frank said, "Oh, sure." And he became a member of the Tommy Dorsey band. But 3 years later, he went solo, and he arguably became the first teen idol. And by that, I mean there were teenage girls swooning in the aisles. That wouldn't happen again until Elvis showed up, and then, of course, the Beatles. It's unmistakable that he's one of the most notable, the top musical figures of the past century. He had a 60-year-long career on stage, on the radio, recordings, lots of hits. And he managed to stay relevant throughout all those decades. Even when in the 1960s, when the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were big hits, he was still selling a lot of records. If you remember, My Way came out in the late 60s. In the late 60s, Sinatra became enamored with Jobim's compositions. He dedicated 2 albums to him. And the first one came out in 1969 and the second one in 1971. And we're going to hear Sinatra sing the lyrics, the English lyrics to the song Wave, but I don't know who translated that to English. Could have been Jobim, I don't know. And you're going to hear Sinatra sing the lowest note he ever recorded. It's an E flat, and you'll hear it multiple times as we listen to an excerpt from the 1971 album, Sinatra and Company. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that Jobim is playing piano and guitar on this track, but also that the arranger is Eumir Deodato. More about him later. Let's listen to Sinatra.
So close your eyes, for that's a lovely way to be. Aware of things your heart alone was meant to see. The fundamental loneliness goes whenever two can dream or dream together. You can't deny, don't try to fight the rising sea. Don't fight the moon, the stars above, don't fight me. The fundamental loneliness goes whenever two can dream or dream together. When I saw you first, the time was 3:30. When your eyes met mine, it was eternity. By now we know is on its way to be. Just catch the wave, don't be afraid of loving me. The fundamental loneliness goes whenever two can dream or dream together. I saw you first, the time was 3:30. When your eyes met mine, it was eternity. By now we know the wave is on on its way to be. Just catch that wave, don't be afraid of loving me. The fundamental loneliness goes whenever two can dream a dream together. Together.
There's the voice and an E flat. If you're wondering about the discrepancy on the slide between the dates at the top and the bottom, it's because the song was recorded, the album was recorded in 1969, released on 8-track cassette. There were 3,500 copies made, and then Columbia Records decided, maybe we shouldn't do this. We want to re-strategize. And they tried to recall the cassettes. Only 5 are known to exist. 3 of them are held by Columbia Records. So we don't know what happened to the others. They're in people's collections or in landfills, who knows. But they then released it in a different package in 1971, different tracks. And this is what you just heard now. So that's one treatment of Wave. Here's another one from Sarah Vaughan. 2 years later, she recorded this version of Wave as well. And I think you will agree that she has an extraordinary voice, tremendous range, and a lot of expression, as you're going to hear in a moment. We've talked about Sarah Vaughan in the past installments, so I won't dwell on this here. Interestingly, from 1967 to 71, she didn't record, and I'm not sure why. But when she came back to recording, as in 73, we're about to hear, apparently her voice got deeper, but there was no change in the range or the power of the voice. So let's listen to a live performance or part of it from an album titled Live in Japan. And she has a pianist, Carl Schroeder, with her, drummer Jimmy Cobb, and bassist John Gianelli. And listen to her version of Wave.
So close your eyes, for that's a lovely way to be. Whenever two can dream a dream together. You can't deny. Don't try to fight the rising sea. Don't fight the moon, the stars above, and don't fight me. The fundamental loneliness goes whenever two can dream a dream together. When I saw you first, the time was 3:30. When
was eternity. For now we know the wave is on its way to be. Don't fight the wave, don't be afraid, don't be afraid of loving me. The fundamental innocence, whenever two can dream a dream together. So close your eyes, for that's a lovely way to be.
A totally different treatment of the same song. And I suspect you'll agree that that might be the epitome of perfectly controlled vibrato. Tremendous vibrations there. I'm going to conclude here and allow for questions from people here in the classroom and perhaps some who are in cyberspace. Anything at all? Yes. Oh, yes.
Spend so much fun learning about the origin of many of these songs that we heard our whole life, and the entertainers, and the singers. It's just been a wonderful experience. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. The comment from the audience was that this has been a good experience learning about the origins of the songs that we are in some way familiar with, and we've barely scratched the surface, and also learning about the entertainers and the composers. So we take a lot of these for granted. We intuitively know the names Gershwin and Porter, but do we know Ray Henderson? No. Gene DePaul, not so much, and some lyricists. Well, no, but this is an opportunity, and what we've done here is barely scratch the surface. We only have, and this is the optimistic part, we only have 267 songs to go. So maybe next term we'll do another one, but I'm glad you enjoyed it. Anything else? Cyberspace?
No, actually, I don't have anything in chat for you, but if you are at home and want to unmute yourself, if you have a question or comment.
You can be a disembodied voice. And I do hope that everyone found this at least of some interest, and that you took notes on some voices and perhaps musicians that you'll want to explore further. That was one of the ultimate goals that I had. Many of the performers that I presented to you, the contemporary ones especially, are not very well known, which is unfortunate. They don't get enough airplay. But hopefully there are some names there that you will want to pursue. There's a question in the back.
Question, would you find those names on Spotify?
Yeah, the second one, electroencephalograph. No. Oh, Eeg, Ms. Eeg. Yes. Okay. So the question is, can you find these performers on Spotify or elsewhere? So the short answer is probably on Spotify. I'm not familiar with it. I was more familiar with Pandora, and Pandora also would be another source. So if you put the name of some obscure singer or musician into Pandora or Spotify, if it's in the catalog that they have, it will come up. I don't know if they're going to have the entire catalog of the artist or not, but you can try that. And that Danish singer, her name is Sine, S-I-N-N-E, Eeg, E-E-G. Another thing you should do as well, you should consult YouTube. You'd be surprised at how many of these songs you might find by putting in the name of an artist into YouTube. It may be a performance, a video of the performance. It may be just the audio portion of a recording, but that's another way to explore as well. So I encourage you to do that.
I agree. I really enjoyed seeing.
Yes, fabulous voice.
Really, what a great job you did is the detail you gave us about the bassist accompanying her, playing with bow and
Strumming.
strumming. The range of that bass was amazing. So beautiful.
And I think it's important for me to point out that jazz is truly an international language. And it's true that America has a vast number of great jazz musicians and singers, but there are some equally good, talented people elsewhere, whether it be in England, in France, Italy. You heard Denmark today. The Dutch have a lot of jazz musicians as well. So it is surprising at how many foreign musicians there are who play very good jazz.
Well, join me in thanking you.
Thank you.
Louis, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Sessions of really beautiful music and just great background.
And,
We look forward to seeing you back.
okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone at home. I'm going to go ahead and close the class. Thanks again.